Go ahead. So you're talking about your father's family?
All right, we ran out of tape, so I'm going to digress a little bit. My father's family consisted of, this is your grandfather, consisted of, I've already told you about his parents. There was a sister an older sister, whose name I don't know, who perished in the Holocaust. And she had 5 children. And was married. She married, of course, and had 5 children. Then there was Aunt Sadie, who came to the United States before my dad, and she had 3 children. There was Frances, who was married and divorced in the day when people didn't get divorced, certainly not. It was very uncommon for Jewish people to get divorced. She had 1 daughter, Suzanne, who lives in Lawrence, Kansas, as far as I know. I think her husband's retired. He was a professor of statistics in the business school at the University of Kansas. Then Aunt Sadie's other children were Lillian, who didn't get married until fairly late in life. I think she was around 50 or more. She married a widower and had no children, and she recently died, and I think she was probably around 90. And then there was Milton. Milton changed his name. The family name was Yudkovitz. That was my Aunt Sadie's husband's name. Milton changed his name to Jarrett, and he has 2 children. There's David, who's a psychiatrist in Athens, Georgia. He's with his second wife now, and he has 2 sons. And then there's Rosalind, Rosalind Jarrett, lives in Los Angeles and does something with the Music Guild, I believe. She's in some sort of administrative position, and she's divorced, I think, the second time, and has no children. Okay, then I was talking about my family. We lived in a very blue-collar neighborhood. My dad's store was on the main thoroughfare in that area, and we lived on a side street, McMillan.
You were talking about whether your family observed.
Oh, okay. We were talking about the religiosity. My grandparents, your great-grandparents were, as far as I can gather, although I didn't know them, but from stories I heard, were observant Jews. Very likely Hasidic, since they were from Galicia, but certainly observant Orthodox Jews. There was no Reformed Judaism in Galicia. My dad and my mother probably would have, I'm sure if you had asked them, they would say they were Orthodox Jews. They could not totally observe the Shabbat and be in that business, because they worked with the working class clientele, and they got paid on Friday or Saturday, and they spent it right away. So they couldn't observe the Shabbat. They went to services sometimes in the summertime when they had late services, and certainly on the high holidays, Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, the store was closed, and they would not ride, they walked. In the old days when the synagogue was downtown, they took a hotel room and stayed there.
Would you go with them?
I don't think so. I think I came on the bus or somebody brought me. And Aunt Molly and her husband did the same. Aunt Molly and Uncle Jaime were in the same business. Elsewhere, I think I referred to the fact that the families were extremely close. You know, it was interesting. My mother we kept kosher. Our house was absolutely kosher. My mother observed the Sabbath in her own way. I can remember asking her to sew a button on my shirt. And she say, no, not till after Shabbos. Put it down and I'll get it after Shabbos. So in their own way, they observed it, but they could not observe it the way their parents did and be in that business and survived in that business.
Did they speak the languages that they came from in the house? Did they speak Austrian?
Yeah, but among themselves, they would occasionally speak Yiddish. And Mother and Aunt Molly would speak Yiddish, and Uncle Jaime, although he was born in this country, he was fluent in Yiddish.
So Yiddish, but no Austrian or Polish?
Well, my dad knew several languages. I think their first language had been Yiddish. That's probably what they spoke at home. They also were fluent in Polish because they grew up among Polish people. My dad said he spoke Russian because there was a sizable Ukrainian, that it probably was Ukrainian or Ruthenian, which is a subset of Ukrainian. There was a sizable Ukrainian minority living in that area. In fact, I think he said that most of their farm hands were of that ethnicity. So, you know, they learned the language, and the official language was German, since it was under Austria. And so my parents had learned German in school, and they could speak and read. My mother had came to this country with a whole bunch of classical books written in German. But I think their first language was Yiddish, and particularly if they didn't want me to understand, they would speak Yiddish. And after a while, you start to catch on, and then they would speak Polish, which is like a different world. Yiddish is like German. If you understand Yiddish, you could understand German, and vice versa. Okay, where were we? The Depression. People ask me how it was during the Depression, and I think from my standpoint, I was born in 1931, and I don't remember those early years, but the late 30s, we didn't know it was the Depression, except we heard the word, because that's the way it always been. And people didn't have a lot of money, and you didn't waste anything. And as I said, we were considered by our neighbors to be rich, because relative to them we were. My dad had his own business. Right before the war, my family the neighborhood was really getting bad. I mean, it was run down. And my family had saved and had a certain amount of resources, and they wanted to move into a nicer neighborhood. So in 1941, they bought a piece of land in the West End part of town, which is upper middle class. And they, as I've mentioned before, we were extremely close with Aunt Molly's family. We spent every Sunday with them, and we were a lot of evenings they'd come over.
So wait, during all those the hours of work that the store was open, both your parents worked there?
No, my dad did, and my mother would work. My mother did a lot of the buying, and she did whatever was necessary for the family. So, you know, it wasn't like they were tied in there. And my dad, from time to time, had employees, you know, salespeople, one or more. And the kids, once we were into our teens, in the busy season, which was Saturday and some Saturdays, and around Christmas, we were expected to help.
So did you guys, you or your brother or sister, get to do any like activities like kids do now?
Yes, yes.
And so what did you do for fun?
We played in the neighborhood. We went to the Y as I got older. You know, when I was, I'll come to the point where we moved. After that, you know, I wasn't in the store. When we lived around the corner, you know, being in the store was as natural as being at home.
So when you moved, you kept your store in the same place?
Yes, store, and we continue to own the house, they just rented it out. They kept one room to prepare their meals, because, you know, they were there straight through. You know, they'd take turns eating, or sometimes, from time to time, my dad had one or more clerks, usually one. In 1941, my family had planned to move away for a long time, and we bought a piece of land and we built a house. We built it with Aunt Molly's family. It was
How old were you in 1941?
I was 10 years old. I we lived on well, there was a basement where the garages were kept, and there was a recreation room and some storeroom, and that house is still there. We've seen it. Your mother and I have seen it on one of our trips back there, and the man that owns it now has fixed it up. We lived on and it was on a hill, so you drove in to the garages from the back, and we were on the ground floor, the first floor. We had the first floor. It was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, brick house, and on about a half acre. And Aunt Molly and her family were upstairs on the second floor. So we literally lived in the same house, but it was like 2 apartments. Going back, my folks sent me to Sunday school. There were 3 synagogues in Nashville, an Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. And in my very early days, I guess we didn't have, our synagogue did, we belonged to the Orthodox synagogue. There wasn't much difference between the Orthodox and Conservative. There were, people often went back and forth depending on who they were mad at. The Reform in those days was very Reform. It was hardly Jewish, not like it is today. And in the very early days, I remember going to the Sunday school in the Reform temple because we didn't have one. And then after I was bar mitzvah, I went for about 3 years to the Reform Sunday school because my folks wanted me to continue my education. So I had exposure to both Orthodox and Reform. I went to Hebrew school after school, 4 days a week. The synagogue was downtown, so I'd take the bus from school to the synagogue and then go home. And this was from age 8 until I was 13 in bar mitzvah. So it was 5 years. In 1941, and we didn't know the war was coming. The war had already broken out in Europe, and although the war broke out in Europe, Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939. And most people consider that the beginning of World War II. There were some things that went on before that.
And meanwhile, your parents or whoever had relatives over there is trying to contact them and just doesn't hear anything?
No, they were still in contact. And well, they were in contact. I don't remember at what point Dad got the last letter, but he could quote you the exact date that the last letter came. My mother's immediate family were all here. She did have cousins that I don't know how close contact, even some of the cousins were in this country. We moved, I think in September of 1941. I was in Hebrew school and I wasn't sure which house to go to because I knew we were moving, so I had to call up to find out where do I go home. Anyway, so we moved in September. The war, Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 1941. I remember that date. I was in the high fifth. You know, there were 2 semesters, and we had, you could start school in the middle of the year, and there were 2 halves of each grade, the high and the low. And because of that, I was on this, not in the right timing, the first year after we moved, I had to go to a school that was not close to our house because they didn't offer. I had to either go back a semester, which might have not been a bad idea, or go to another school. And then I went to summer school so that in junior high I was ready in September to start the 7th grade. I was one of the youngest in my class.
How come you were so young?
They started me when I was
Skip a
5.
grade or anything?
I think my parents lied about my age, my
They wanted to
birthday.
get you out of the house?
No, they wanted me to, they thought it was good to get on with schooling, I guess.
Your parents haven't been very educated. Did they give you a
Well, they,
sense of the importance of it?
yes, oh yeah, education was important. My parents did not have college education, if that's what you mean. They had been educated, they had gone to school in the old country, and then they went to night school to learn English. And I know Aunt Molly went to business school to learn bookkeeping and to be a secretary. And I think my mother even had some of that. They both were, especially my mother, were avid readers. So they were largely self-educated. And I don't know what the education was like in Europe at that time, but I think they probably had the equivalent of a high school education. Neither of my parents went to college.
But how common was it back then for parents to go to college?
Not common, very common at all. Most of my friends had, their families were pretty much the same. They were the children of immigrants. Now, not the Reform group. The Reform group were, many of them were descendants of German Jews who had come like 50 or 60 years earlier, like in San Francisco. The first Jews were the German Jews who came over around 1850. And then the Eastern European Jews came from about 1880 to 1920. So no, my parents were not college educated. I remember an incident when I was still in grammar school, probably about the 4th or 5th grade, when you probably had this experience. They wanted kids to get up and tell something about themselves and what their daddy did, and what are you going to do when you finish school. I remember, you know, a lot of the kids were in blue-collar jobs, and they were very shocked when I said my dad runs a dry goods store, because probably none of their family had their own businesses. And almost all of them, when it came to what are you going to do when you got out of school, I'm going to get a job, or I'm going to work in the mill where my dad works, or I'm going to be a soldier boy. This is, of course, 4th or 5th graders. And I was the only one that said, well, I'll go to college. I had, without even discussing it, I had the impression that that's what you do when you finish school, because both my brother and sister had done that. So that was the environment that I, and frankly most Jewish kids where I lived, grew up with. Okay.
What did you want to go to college for when you were, or what did you want to be when you grew up?
Okay, you know, I don't remember. I think Franklin Roosevelt was like a deity in our house. So at a very early age, I was going to be president. That's probably a lot of kids.
Even now?
Well, now for different reasons. You know,
Kids would want to be president now?
Well, in those days, we wanted to be like Franklin Roosevelt. I guess in the Clinton age, the teenage boys wanted to be president so they could hit on girls, but that wasn't the motivation. Later on, when people would, I mean, people ask you stupid things when you're a kid that you really can't answer, like who do you love better, mother or dad? I can remember stupid adults asking that, and I'd say, I don't know, because I did. Or if your parents got divorced, who would you go with? I don't know. These were stupid things for people, but I hope they don't do that anymore. when people asked me what I wanted to do, at one time I was going to be president. Then later on, it was I was going to be a lawyer. Now, why? Because already I knew my brother was going to be a doctor. He was either in college, pre-med, or in medical school, and just to be different, you know, doctor, lawyer, engine chief. So for no particular reason. And then later, when I was in junior high school and late high school, I got interested in science, and I was going to be an engineer. We had to do a career study, I think in the 9th grade, and I looked into 3 different branches of engineering. So I did not make up my mind early that I was going to be a doctor, unlike a lot of my colleagues. Okay, where are we? We moved in 1941, upper middle class neighborhood. One year I went to a school far away. Oh, I remember Pearl Harbor Day. It was on a Sunday, and I was 10, and we used to go downtown. Instead of the Jewish Community Center, they called it the YMHA, Young Men's Hebrew Association, as an alternative to the YMCA. And I was going down there to swim. I had an indoor swimming pool. And I remember hearing something from the older kids. We knew a war was going on in Europe, and I was very interested in geography and what was going on. So I knew vaguely what was going on, which countries had already been invaded and captured. France was already out of the war. Hitler had captured France, conquered France, and the Battle of Britain was on. The sentiment in this country, at least as I knew it in Nashville, was overwhelmingly people were pro-Ally. I mean, the Germans were bad guys, and allies. Probably some of that was a holdover from the First World War, because when little boys played soldier, we were always, the enemy was Germans. This was in the 30s. And I picked it up from the older kids. But the sentiment was overwhelmingly pro-England. We were sending bundles to Britain, like food and blankets, but there was a strong isolationist feeling in this country. Didn't want to, don't send our boys to war. And Roosevelt ran on that platform in 1940, I won't send you boys to war. We'd already had started the draft because he had declared a state of emergency. Stuff I've read, he knew we had to get into it, but he didn't have the country behind him. When Pearl Harbor, I started to tell you about Pearl Harbor Day. I went downtown to swim, and going in, I remember hearing something about the Japanese were attacking Pearl Harbor, and we didn't know where that was. Somebody thought it was in the Philippines. We didn't know it was in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. And then when we came out, other people had heard the radio and said, well, the Japanese have declared war not on us, but on the Philippines, all kinds of false information. The next day, this was December, and we were in school, and the next day in school, they took us all to the auditorium to hear, there was no TV then, and at least not in Nashville. To hear on the radio, Roosevelt addressed Congress, and then they voted. It was almost unanimous. There was to declare war on Japan, Germany, and France, and Italy. There was one congresswoman who, just as a matter of principle, voted against it. She was a pacifist, and the people were right behind us.
Sounds like September 11th.
Yes, somewhat. Except September 11th happened out of the blue. This you could see. I wasn't old enough to see it coming, but a lot of people who were aware of what was going on in the world could see it coming. So it wasn't. People already were being drafted and trained. I think you went into the Army for a year or maybe 2 years, and they pulled numbers out of you know, as a lottery type thing. And but we really were not prepared. We were building armament and supplying it. Congress, there was an isolationist Congress, and the isolationists were the right-wing Republicans. They did not want us to even supply arms. They said, stay out of it. Well, Roosevelt got around this by instituting what he called Lend-Lease.
Wait, I have an ignorant, very ignorant question. What party was Roosevelt?
Democratic. And Roosevelt was very popular. And my family...
Even with Republicans?
Pardon?
Even with Republicans?
Oh, I'd say with...
I mean, like Kennedy was...
I don't, you know, there were certainly Republicans. In those days, the South, they called it the Solid South, but it was solid Democrat, whereas now it's mostly Republican. Republicans were not a big issue. They were, you know, but it was a minority party in the South. And Roosevelt had great popularity among, you know, he put together a coalition of the South, labor, and the minorities.
You say Roosevelt was like a deity in your house. Were your parents politically active?
I don't know what you mean by that. Probably
How
not.
was he a deity?
But they worshipped him. They just thought he was, I mean, they had the European attitude. They worshipped, incidentally, my dad particularly, Kaiser Franz Joseph, was a great man as far as they were concerned. He was the emperor of the country they had come from, whereas Galicia was just really a colony almost. It wasn't really considered Austria by the Austrians, but it was very loyal to. But Roosevelt was greatly admired in our house. And when the war was declared, boy, you didn't hear any, after Pearl Harbor, you heard no dissent, at least not in my experience. It may have been different in New York or some other parts of the country. And people were lining up to join the military. The draft dodgers were few and far between, and nobody was going to Canada. Canada was already in the war. They had joined to support England because they're part of the Commonwealth.
So you were 11 and Irving was what, about 20?
Irving would have been, no, I was 10.
He was 12 and 13.
Irving would have been almost, he would have been 22. He was 22. He was probably, oh, I'm sure he was. He was in medical school by that time.
At where?
At Vanderbilt. Irving had gone to college. Ruth Ann Irving went to Unfog High School, which still exists downtown Nashville. Irving went to college, undergraduate college at Vanderbilt. He did it in 3 years, like I did. Ruth went to Peabody, which was a teacher's college across the street from Vanderbilt. And Irving went on to medical school at Vanderbilt.
Was he deferred from joining the war?
Well, in medical school, yeah. They didn't draft anybody at once. You know,
No.
I'll look this.
Hey.
Wait, shall we wait for Pam?
Go ahead.
I can hear you. Go.
Where were we? We were, the war broke out. No, Irving did not go in the Army. He was in medical school, and he graduated from medical school in 1942. It would have been June.
Did he ever consider going in the Army, or was
Not at that point. He was in medical school, so he wanted, and he was almost finished. And he went into his internship. He went to Baltimore, to Sinai Hospital, and finished that in 43, and actually was deferred for a residency. Oh, we turned it off.
Ron?
Okay, when the war broke out, you know, it wasn't as though, although suddenly we were in war and on a war footing, I think more so in the Northeast than and in California than where I lived in Nashville. But it wasn't as though they could take everybody into the service. So they had to build up the military gradually, and we were actually losing the war early on because we were completely unprepared. The Japanese destroyed our battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor in one day. And there wasn't much going on in Europe. We had a few troops, I think, already in England, just observers. And we started to train troops and go over there. You ask about Irving. He was in medical school when the war broke out. He was probably in his last year. So he finished medical school, and then he was deferred for an internship. He went to Baltimore to Sinai Hospital, and he was deferred for a residency because they needed people with training. They could get lots of soldiers, they could even get doctors, but they needed surgeons. My mother didn't know this, but he actually volunteered. He said that he could not, he felt like everybody was looking at him, wondering what this was about the middle of, or latter part of 43, what's this healthy young man doing out of uniform? So he volunteered, and we didn't know about that until there was a newspaper article about him. They interviewed him, and we found out that he had volunteered for the Army. And then later, he volunteered again for the ground forces. That's another story.
Meaning to fight?
Well, he was a doctor. All right. He was initially, at that time, the Air Force was not a separate branch. There was the Army Air Corps. And he was initially assigned, after some basic training or orientation, because they don't, doctors don't go through the same basic training. He was assigned to Hammer Field, which was in Fresno. It's a Fresno airport, and ironically, he served some time at this little satellite field, which is now the Visalia Airport, and after the war, he
I
went
was
back
just
there
there last
to
week.
practice. Really? That's where your uncle
Awful.
lived?
It's an awful place.
What, Visalia?
The whole Fresno, all that central valleys.
Okay,
So that's how
anyway,
that's what brought him to California.
no, he came back afterwards. He felt he wanted, they probably were being trained to go to the Pacific, because he went to some jungle training in Orlando, Florida, some base there. So their unit was probably going to go to the Pacific, but apparently he volunteered for the ground forces, and they sent him to Breckenridge, Kentucky. They were making up a new division, the 75th Division. So then, sort of in the last year of the war, they were sent over. They were in England. They were still being trained. And then, I don't know if you've heard of the Battle of the Bulge. They just recently celebrated the anniversary of it, came. And this was the sort of the Germans' last effort to force a stalemate. I think any intelligent general, Hitler wouldn't accept it, knew the war was lost. But this was their last effort. Things that have been written was that they thought they could drive a wedge between the British and the American, and maybe the American public would get tired of the war, and they could get a treaty and go fight the Russians. Anyway, when that happened, they threw all the reserve. I mean, they were really very effective at first, and they threw all the reserves in, and Irving's division was thrown in, not completely trained. And I'll tell you about his war experience.
And he was a doctor in the war?
He was a doctor. He was a surgeon. He was attached to an infantry regiment.
Mm-hmm.
And he won a Purple Heart and a Bronze Cross, a Bronze Star. I'm sorry, Bronze Star, for going through driving on a road under shelling to pick up some wounded, and then he was slightly injured by a artillery shell. Didn't amount to much, but he got a Purple Heart for that because he was reported as injured. For me, I was in the lower half of the 5th grade when the war broke out, and then, you know, all through the 6th grade and the junior high school. And for my age group, the war was kind of exciting. I was 10 years old, and I was 14 when the war ended, and already and decided I wanted to join the Marines when I was old enough. And that was just, all my friends were like that.
Mm-hmm.
We were always playing war. And we did things like, we had drives, paper drives. We went, like they pick up our paper for recycling, and the school kids picked it up and brought it to the school. We also picked up tin cans to recycle, scrap metal. Women saved the grease from cooking, and they supposedly were using it to make TNT. So they had the school kids going door to door. We even had contests of which class could collect the most. And people were buying bonds and savings bonds and savings stamps. The effort was almost universal. Everybody pitched in. The women were knitting and socks for the soldiers. Everybody wanted to help. And most of the young men, by the 1945, most of the young men were in the military, unless you were in an essential occupation or were disabled, had some physical disability. You went into the military. Murray, right at the end, went into the Navy. They made him a medical corpsman. He never got on a ship or went overseas. And there were people from my town who were captured, wounded, killed, people that I heard about. The war ended. I was in the 9th grade. Germany gave up in May, and we knew about that. And I think that was...
And did your dad immediately go looking for his family?
Did he what?
Immediately go looking for his family?
He couldn't travel overseas.
No, I mean, like,
Okay,
through however you
well,
look.
what he did was, he immediately got the Red Cross to look for them.
That's what I mean.
And
How did you find out about the war? What was going on? Was it radio or?
radio, mostly radio. I used to listen to radio a lot, and newspapers.
There wasn't TV in the 50s, 40s?
Not in Nashville.
No.
It was in New York. I remember visiting New York. And I'll tell you about that incident. But it hadn't come to Nashville, and it was what we had in New York was primitive compared to what you've got now. I mean, the quality. The summer of '44, after my bar mitzvah, they were sending me to camp. I think Workman Circle Camp. But I never went, so I went to New York and I stayed with Aunt Sarah, and I never went to camp because there was a polio epidemic. But anyway, I ended up living in Brooklyn with her for the whole summer. And I really think that was a neat experience. Here, a kid from Tennessee, it was a completely different environment. In those days, you had the ethnic neighborhood. Everybody from blocks around was Jewish. Then there was an Italian neighborhood and a black neighborhood, and there were other ethnic neighborhoods, and that's just the way it was in those days. When the war ended, I was in the 9th grade, and I'm just trying to think.
When did you find out that there was a Holocaust?
Well, there were rumors. We knew bad things were happening. We didn't know the
How
extent
did you
of
know?
it. News that came out, news items, rumors.
But was there any first-hand accounts from the letters that
There
came
were,
out?
no. My folks, after a certain date, my dad didn't get any letters. And after the war, he had
So they
read-
didn't see anything coming?
Pardon?
He didn't see any of the...
Oh, yeah. We knew things were bad. And you hoped against hope that people were all right. And, when you're at war, it's not like now when in the Persian Gulf where we have reporters in Baghdad giving a blow-by-blow description. There was no contact with the enemy. There were stories that came out. Both sides had spies in the other country. And actually people got out people actually got out of the concentration camp, brought pictures of what was going on, and the State Department suppressed it, including Roosevelt. That's the sad commentary. And refugees, although many refugees were taken in, many were turned away.
Why did they do that?
Why? Okay, I think, well, first of all, things got bad in Germany after Hitler took office in '33, and so a lot of German Jews were leaving, and the ones that were smart were getting out, and some came here. And then it got worse and worse. And you could still leave. You had to leave everything behind. And if you were in an essential occupation, like John Danberg's dad was a chemist, they wouldn't let him leave. His boss got him out. That's another story. But you could still leave until 1939 when the war broke out with Poland. And then it was very difficult. You had to sneak out. And some countries took a few, but then they stopped taking them. I think
because there were too many, and it was.
All right. I've asked this of a historian that wrote the book that Freedom from Fear. You know, there's one famous story of the St. Louis, the ship that was bringing a shipload of German Jews to Cuba, and then they were turned away, and they tried to come to the United States and were turned away, and they tried to go to England, and they went back to Germany, and many of them perished. Mm-hmm. I've asked David Kennedy, he said, yeah, there probably was an element of anti-Semitism, but also there was an isolationist feeling in the United States. We were still not out of the Depression. You know, the war ended the Depression. There were plenty of jobs when the war came, and people didn't want a bunch of foreigners coming in and taking the few jobs that were available. So I think that was a factor, and you know, we could have absorbed them, and Switzerland turned them away, Sweden, England took those that could get to England were taken in, and the people that you meet who are survivors, they had somebody help them, in most cases, or they survived by their guile. After the war, my dad tried very hard to locate his family. My brother actually took leave. He was in, probably in Belgium or maybe even Germany when the war ended. And they couldn't, we had 1.5 million men. At first, everybody was going to be transferred directly to the Pacific to fight Japan, because Germany gave up. Italy had already given up before this. And we were being prepared, you know, by our leaders and by the mass media that it was going to take 2 more years. Japan was already in retreat. We had already, I don't know how far we'd gotten. I'd liberated the Philippines and a lot of the islands, you know, Guadalcanal. I think Iwo Jima and Okinawa were already liberated. And we were being prepared that it's going to take 2 more years and a few million men to defeat Japan. There was no question we were going to win, but they were prepared to fight to the bitter end. And nobody, or almost nobody, knew about the atomic bomb. In August, they dropped the bomb, and then they dropped the second one, and abruptly the war ended.
What was people's reaction in the U.S. when they heard about the bomb?
Oh, I think everybody thought it was wonderful. Pardon?
Patriotism?
Absolutely, Pam. You got to remember that, you know, I was on a ship on one of those cruises, and a Catholic guy, shared our table from Philadelphia, and he said that recently his priest had made a talk about it, the immorality of the bomb, and he went up and talked to him afterwards. He said, you know, I probably wouldn't have been here had they not dropped the bomb. He was on a ship in Palau, which is one of the islands ready to invade Japan. I don't know how closely kept this secret was, but literally the military was planning the invasion of the Japanese islands, and it would have been very bloody. And we were prepared to lose 1 million casualties. So I know to your generation, it sounds like it was an immoral thing. They could have maybe done something different, dropped it on an unpopulated area. Maybe they didn't need to drop the second one. But at the time, I don't think there was a lot of objection. That came later. That came later.
I mean, when we started realizing that other countries could create something like that and drop it on us?
I think they already knew that. They knew that. But at the time, we were, you know, it's hard for you to realize now, but World War II, we were fighting a war of survival. And you'll do a lot of things. I think by the time we dropped the bomb, it was already pretty obvious that we weren't going to lose. But in the early days of the war, it wasn't that obvious.
We thought Japan was going to beat us?
Japan and Germany. Right? I mean, the first months of the war, Japan swept all the way through the Pacific. They were stopped in their effort to invade Australia, and had,
By Australia?
well, by our neighbor. That's another story. But I was too young to really realize the peril we were in, but a lot of people felt that. And we were really never attacked to any extent on our shores. Hawaii was attacked. And that's a different story. I'll go into that another time. So after the war, everybody relaxed. You know, I went into high school. Almost immediately, the Cold War started. I mean, Russia had been our ally during the war, and they were great guys and heroic people, and we were supplying them arms, but it was pretty obvious what their intention was, to some people.
You mean communism?
Right after war, that they wanted to spread their influence. Stalin wanted to spread their influence. Where do you want to go?
Probably about 10 minutes until it gets blank, so just keep it.
Okay. You know, I finished high school in 1948. Was accepted to Vanderbilt.
Is that the only school you applied to?
Yeah, as a matter of fact.
Was it hard to get into at the time?
Yeah, it was competitive. It was competitive, but I was accepted, and I was in the upper middle class high school of the city, West End High School, and a lot of kids went to college. In the other blue-collar neighborhoods, not many kids went to college, even at that time, by 48. And I got into Vanderbilt. I was a chemistry major, and
You were a nerd?
no, I was a fraternity. I was a frat boy. I was a part
Of a Jewish fraternity?
Absolutely. I mean, we'll digress a little bit. In the 30s and 40s, there was definitely, you experienced and you heard anti-Semitism. There was a dichotomy. Many of the professional people and business people in town were Jews. The head of the county board of education was a Jew. The city councilman was Jewish. There was a Jewish judge. And on the other hand, you heard a lot of anti-Semitism and experienced anti-Semitism.
So did you have personal experiences of it?
Yeah, oh yeah.
For example?
Because that was the norm. Nasty comments from kids at school, mostly the lower class. And the upper class, the swanky country club in town, which were the rich folks, and the socially prominent was white Protestant Anglo-Saxon.
Some of them still are.
Well, to some extent. Of course, the Jews, the wealthy Jews had their own country club at the time, and then a second one opened up. So they had their own institution. You just knew when you went to college that you were going to belong to a Jewish fraternity. That's the way it was. It was a kind of what they called almost like a gentleman's agreement, that they had the Gentile fraternities, and there were 2 Jewish fraternities and 1 Jewish sorority. In fact, when I was accepted to Vanderbilt, during the summer, I think I got a letter and a postcard to return, and you checked off boxes. It didn't ask, are you Jewish? It says, are you interested in being rushed by a fraternity? You check it off. Are you interested in being rushed by a Jewish fraternity? Check it off. It was just common knowledge. And the same thing in med school. There were 2 med school fraternities and no Jewish med school fraternity, and Jews were not taken into and we knew that. Not that I wanted to belong to a fraternity in med school.
Wasn't there some quota for med school of only a few Jewish people?
Pardon?
Wasn't there a quota?
Yes. I think by the time I came along, the quotas didn't exist. When my brother went on pretty much the same track, same college, same med school, same fraternity. When he was in med school, he said the dean had the class there were 52 even when I was in school and accepted. They had 6,000 applicants. No, 1,600. 1,600 the year I applied. They've had as many as 6,000. And they accepted 52. Now, a lot of people of those 1,600 may have got accepted somewhere else. But at Vanderbilt, 52. And when my brother was in school, they took 2 Jews and 2 Catholics every year. And never more. And no blacks. That was true when I was in school. I think the quota had been done away with. There were 3 Jewish boys in my class, a class before me there were 5. I don't feel that I was discriminated against.
Could you lie? And how would they know if you were Jewish? By your last name or what?
Somehow they know. In the class ahead of my brother, one of the guys that taught me, and probably the most influential teacher we had, was a guy named Shapiro, spelled Shapiro. I mean, he pronounced it Shapiro. He was from a small town in Tennessee. His father was Jewish. Shapiro's a Jewish name. His mother was not. I don't know what he considered himself. He married a non-Jewish woman, and his children were not raised Jewish. But he apparently was considered Jewish because there was only one other Jew in that class, a guy that was advisor in my fraternity. So that's the way it was. I don't know when they did away with the quota. And this was the case in a lot of places. Cornell, Columbia, Hopkins, all the Ivy League schools. Not only in medical school, but undergrad, they had quotas. And, I started to tell you about my brother. They were invited to the dean of the medical school's house in, a fourth of the class one night, and then others. And afterwards, the guy is sitting around pontificating, and he said, Vanderbilt is a Southern school for Southern young men. Most of the acceptances were from the Southeast. And of course, we keep certain racial groups to a minimum. And he meant Jews and probably Catholics, because they didn't take any blacks, and there weren't any other races there. So they made no. It wasn't. I don't know that it was written down anywhere, but it was widely known that most of the big name private schools had quota. One of the guys that I worked at camp with in the summer had gone to Cornell med school, and this was about the time that they still had quotas when I was an undergrad. And he said that he heard one of the officials, this was word of mouth, had defended this policy. He said in New York, if they didn't have a quota on Jews, over half the class would be Jewish. Mm-hmm. So Cornell and Columbia took a limited number of Jews, and NYU, which was New York University, the other school in town, was mostly Jews.
Now, when did you decide to go to medical school?
I think I was a junior, and I was sort of toying with the idea in undergrad school. I was a chemistry major. I didn't take the standard pre-med courses. I sort of took my own courses, what I wanted. And I was going to be a chemist. And I guess sometime around the beginning of my third year, I decided to apply. And it's the only med school I applied to. I didn't tell my parents for a while that I had applied until I had to get money from them to get the picture taken.
Did you intentionally follow in Irving's footsteps, or?
Not consciously. Can I say that that was a role model and it had something to do with it? I can't say it wasn't, but
People
I
about
didn't.
the urology part.
Oh, that was different. He was not a
Oh, I
urologist.
thought he was.
No, he was a surgeon, general
I thought he was
surgeon.
a urologist.
No, general surgeon.
So why did you become a urologist?
I wanted to do something surgical, and I decided sort of to narrow the field so I could know it all. And also when I was in med school, everything you heard was that there were too many surgeons and it was difficult. And a subspecialty, urology is a subspecialty of surgery. Irving was what's called a general surgeon, which usually means all the rest. It doesn't mean that they do urology, although he did a lot of gynecology, where he trained surgeons did the gynecology.
You mean like C-sections?
C-sections, hysterectomy. Okay.
Wait, so what year did you graduate college?
I went into medical school as a senior in absentia. I don't know if you've ever heard that. In other words, I went to undergraduate school for 3 years, then went into med school, and the first year of med school counted toward my BA degree. So I was in class of 52, and I actually went through graduation and got a diploma. But by that time, I already finished the year of med school. They kind of screwed us because they gave us quality points, hours, but no quality points.
There's something blinking.
So,
Probably almost
when we
done.
stop,
Maybe should we change date?
okay, I'll stop. Do you want to turn off your audio?
Yeah.